Okay, to begin today's class, a quick 2-minute video about the economy to kind of be an introduction to the lesson.
From the Atlantic to the Pacific, more evidence today of a strong economy. The 4.1% economic growth in the second quarter, the strongest since a 5% quarter in 2014 during the Obama administration. President Trump today was quick to take credit.
These numbers are very, very sustainable. This isn't a one-time shot. I happen to think we're going to do extraordinarily well in our next report, next quarter.
In Chicago, real estate technology company Trust, started just a year ago, has already gone from 6 to 33 employees. CEO Andrew Boker is still hiring. Why the optimism? What's happening here on the ground in Chicago?
It's a vibrant economy, and I think people are positive about how it's going to turn out for them. And it's certainly from a small to medium-sized business, there's a lot of support.
Corporate leaders suggest last year's tax cut gave the economy a jolt. Now, a sudden surge in agricultural activity before the trade war and tariffs kicked in appear to have provided a sudden one-time boost. Nobel Prize-winning economist Lars Peter Hansen.
Trade wars could be a substantial drag on the economy because the economy these days is integrated. One country starts imposing tariffs and other ones counterbalance that.
Areas of lingering concern, stagnant worker wages, a growing budget deficit, and farmers who are paying the price for trade disputes with China, Mexico, and Canada.
Our corn commodity prices are down approximately 25% since the first year. We're operating at a loss right now.
The country's strong economic growth comes at a time when we're also experiencing the longest streak of hiring on record. Unemployment just 4%, and robust hiring going on in business, manufacturing, and healthcare.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our youth.
Okay, I shared that video because if you watch the news much, or if you hear any of the administration's announcements for President Trump, the economy is very important. And of course, being a billionaire, he is the richest citizen to ever be president. And even his foreign policy, he talks about in terms a lot about in relation to how is it benefiting the United States economically. And I share all that and say that to illustrate what my high school history teacher said way back in the 20th century. He was a coach. A lot of times high school teachers get a bad rap because they're a coach, but he knew his stuff. And I remember at the beginning of history class, or the term that year, he said, there's one thing that makes the world go round, and that's money. And so in light of that, as we begin to look at these factors that helped bring about the American Revolution, a lot of it has to do with who's getting the money. Not everything, but money is a vital factor in this. All right, let me bring up another one. We talked briefly, we talked about the French and Indian War. And this was one of the big, what I'm calling one of the big ruffles that led to the rift between Britain and the colonies and eventually the revolution. There was a couple of things that I want to kind of backtrack on that are important. And so I'll indicate to you what you need to be aware of. But these are what I'm referring to as another ruffle that led to the rift. Excuse me. We talked about the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment last time, and those were some of the ripples. And so now we're going to look at some of the ruffles that led to the rift. You need to know about mercantilism. Mercantilism, excuse me. It is in your textbook on page, well, my page is 114, but it's in chapter 4 because I have the, excuse me, I have the double edition book. But mercantilism, and you can tell by the name, money is involved, was an economic system or a theory of economics that benefited a nation greatly through its colonies. So this was something that many of the major European nations were embracing. And you will recall that they each had colonies, not just in North America, but in other continents. And a nation that embraced mercantilism would increase its wealth and power in two ways. Number one, the colonies that they founded would be shipping to the mother country gold and silver as much as possible. The old European countries were, they were populated, and most of their resources had been used or tapped into. And so these new colonies with fresh resources were a great source, especially of gold and silver. And then the second thing about mercantilism that benefited these European countries was they would establish a very favorable balance of trade. Basically, the European country, let's say England, for example, would sold more of their goods than they purchased. And the goal for these European countries under mercantilism was to become completely self-sufficient, where they did not have to depend upon the goods of other countries. So it's very important that they establish more colonies. More colonies equals more raw materials, but also the colonists could only purchase goods from their mother country. So the British colonies in North America were only supposed to purchase goods from England. So mercantilism really benefited the country that embraced it. An example in England, excuse me for a second, I have a sign up on my door and somebody is knocking. Oh, hey, I'll be right over. Bye. Go ahead and take a 5-minute break, guys. I apologize. I'll be right back.
It's a Chromebook thing. You can pull it up on mine, and I have gone and said, don't restrict YouTube. There was a restriction on it. Yeah. And I did say, don't restrict. You sign out and everything? No, we haven't signed out and signed back in. But, yeah. Sign out of everything. No, which I'm surprised I have it restricted. They have automatically said it. It redoes some of the things. But a lot of people use, but I haven't gotten any feedback from anyone else. This is not working. And I know Lamb, you know, if you have like that, she's fine. Yeah, all fine. Well, and it shows some of them. It's not those. There's 2 of them that wouldn't show. But it shows the one before that. I clicked on it and it starts like it's coming. Yeah, she can use my company. Which I'll keep looking. It doesn't really come good setting. No, it did say it usually doesn't. It may take up to 24 hours. It usually doesn't whenever I change the settings.
Okay, I apologize. It was somebody that I had coming here and I forgot about it, so it's my fault. Is everybody still in the rooms right now? We got 2 more minutes. Okay, so an example of this dynamic in between Britain and the colonies was, remember, England at this time now had the premier navy because they had defeated the Spanish Armada over 100 years before this. And but Britain had pretty much exhausted a lot of their forests in England, and so they were depending upon Scandinavia for large pine trees. Well, with the new colonies in New England being so densely wooded, they were now receiving lumber from the colonies, and so the money they were paying to Scandinavia now stayed in their country. So again, the key was that, or the ultimate goal with mercantilism was for each country to become self-sufficient. Now, this benefits the home country greatly, but the colonists, as they start to, as their states or their settlements start to develop or continue to progress, and more and more people become merchants and tradesmen, and they are producing goods, most of those goods have to go back to England, where they can sell it amongst the colonists. But England did not want them to, trade with other nations. That would be hurting their interests. So that is a ruffle that needs to be understood, as well as the colonists could not send their crops and their materials like tobacco and lumber and fish to other countries. They all had to go to England. So again, the Atlantic Ocean is a big factor, and the colonists not always doing what the home country wants them to do. And so some of them started smuggling and doing illegal trading with other countries. And so England passed in 1651 the Navigation Acts. And you need to be familiar with the Navigation Acts. 1651. Now, again, I told you we're kind of backtracking before the French and Indian War. This is a good 100 years. But it lasted for quite some time. And the Navigation Acts said that no country could trade with the colonies unless the goods were shipped in either colonial ships or English ships. So Spain could not trade with the colonies if they were going to the New World and getting things on their own ships. It had to be shipped from the colonists on their ships, or English ships had to transport it. All vessels had to be manned by crews that were at least 3/4 English or colonial. So 75% of ships had to be English, which included the British colonists. Certain products, such as tobacco and sugar, later rice and molasses and furs, could only be shipped to England. That was one of the laws of the Navigation Acts. And then almost all goods that were traded between the colonies and Europe, and that means just not England, but other countries in Europe, first had to be unloaded. So let's say Massachusetts sends a load of lumber to Spain. Before they take that lumber to Spain, they have to stop in England first, unload the cargo. And what this did was it gave dock workers in England a job, and there were taxes on those goods, import taxes, so that gave some money to the English treasury. So this passed in 1651, and as you can imagine, not all the colonists were on board with this. And some continued to smuggle. And tensions started between the colonists in England, really started to ramp up in this time. Because remember the one unofficial policy of England, salutary neglect. As long as the colonies were paying money, paying taxes, giving them goods, they kind of left them alone. Well, with these increased laws, the colonists were not all on board with it. Some of them continued to smuggle, avoid taxes, do things that England did not want them to do. And so in 1685, the King of England at that time he dissolved all of the Northeast colonies, New England, which would include Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and what was later Maine. He dissolved all those individual colonies and their charters, and he formed them into one big territory called the Dominion of New England. That was 1685. Any questions on that? We'll talk a little bit more about that here. So, up until this time, the colonists had enjoyed relatively little government regulation by England. They had become self-governing with their town meetings, their representative governments. The eligible voters could choose the leaders that they wanted. And so now all of a sudden England acts unilaterally to dissolve these individual colonies and make them one territory, and then put an English governor over them. His name was Andros, Andros, Edmund Andros, and he kind of abused his power, did not make friends with the colonists, especially those in Massachusetts. And the colonists finally got tired of it, and they sent Increase Mather. His name was Increase, like we say Increase Mather. They sent him to England to talk with Parliament about this. And the Glorious Revolution in England happened in 1688. And that kind of sidetracked things. And so when the Glorious Revolution happened in 1688, the colonists that were in the Dominion of New England decided to take matters into their own hands, and they imprisoned Andros, and they returned back to the way the colonies were. And eventually they all got their charters back. So these two things are some of the ruffles that were starting to shake things up in a great way. The Navigation Acts were a disruption economically that benefited England and did not sit well with the colonists. And then the Dominion of New England, that situation really struck at the principle of self-governing that was starting to grow in the colonies. So when we move back now to what we started with, the 7 Years' War, where it moves from ruffles to a rift. The first big ruffle, of course, or the big first rift, was the 7 Years' War. And even though that was between England and France, remember what we talked about after that war? England had amassed great debt, and so they felt like since they had engaged in this war to, even though it was protecting their interest, right, the money, they were saying, well, we're doing it to protect the colonies, and so they decided to tax the colonists and pay for the war, basically. And remember that the colonists did not like that. For one thing, the English left 10,000 British troops in North America. And that was to keep Native Americans and the French subjects who still live there from going back in and taking that land that they had won from France. You will recall that England gained after this war, after the French and Indian War, England gained from the Appalachian Mountains west to the Mississippi River. And so they left 10,000 troops behind to basically kind of guard this frontier territory. But remember, it wasn't just to keep the Native Americans from taking it over. It wasn't just to keep the French subjects in line. Remember, they declared that line in 1763 called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And they told the English colonists, you cannot go west of this line. So this is the first big rift. And I guess really we should say after the conclusion of the French and Indian War. Any questions? All right. One of the and you'll want to know for the test all of these things that are up here. So be familiar with the Proclamation of 1763. Also, it's not on here, but also in 1763, at the end of the war, was the Treaty of Paris. And this was where England and Paris drew up their agreement that England would acquire Canada and all of North America east of the Mississippi River. So you might write, I think I did put this on the course homepage on Thursday, so you might just print this first timeline off and then write in above this the Treaty of Paris. So the Proclamation of 1763 was not a real good piece of legislation. It was pretty careless on the English's part, because there were already 30,000 colonists living west of the line. They told them to move back. So those soldiers were left behind by the British to try to enforce that proclamation line. A couple of things that you want to understand about these developments in 1763. The English, the British, they failed to understand the way that the Americans, and I'm going to go ahead and refer to them as Americans now, they failed to understand their way of thinking. And this is why a lot of the things that we're going to look at today are important. It stems from the British not really understanding or even trying to understand the American mindset. The way Britain saw it was, this is our land, these are our people, so we can police them whenever necessary. Parliament can enforce laws. Parliament can tax them, and the colonists should pay for it because we're policing the territory for them, and they should be grateful for it. The Americans didn't think that way. The Americans wanted more cooperation with Parliament. They wanted to be seen more as equals and not as subjects of England. And they're the ones who are living in these 13 colonies. So really the land west of this line is really theirs in a manner, so to speak. And they should not be told what to do by their countrymen way over here across the Atlantic. The British planned to move this line even further west because they wanted to control the colonies. So this was a fatal flaw among the British, not understanding how the colonists thought. Okay, so any questions before we start looking at the several pieces of legislation that England passed? So in 1763, another critical event happened. King George of England chose a man by the name of George Grenville to be the prime minister. Grenville was a financial expert. And as prime minister, he began to lead Parliament to enact laws that would collect more taxes from the colonists. How do you think that turned out? Or how do you think that was received? More taxes for the colonists. They did not like that. Again, look at what we're looking at. Money. Money is an issue. So, the first thing that is passed in 1764 is the Sugar Act. Now, you'll want to know it as the Sugar Act, although the official title was the American Revenue Act of 1764. But it came to be known as the Sugar Act. So there were three basically three provisions for this. Americans were still smuggling, and one of the things that they were smuggling was they were getting their molasses from the Caribbean countries, Caribbean territories. They used it to make rum. So the first thing that the Sugar Act did was, or one of the things that it did was, the tax that was already applied to molasses was cut in half. It was cut from 6 pence a gallon to 3 pence a gallon. And the thinking on this was, if we cut the tax in half, maybe the Americans will now pay it, and they will not risk being arrested for smuggling. So Grenville and Parliament, they already suspected the colonists of smuggling, which was illegal. You could be brought to trial, lose your business, thrown in jail. So let's not be hardline about this. Let's take an approach where let's lower the tax on molasses, and maybe the colonists will embrace that instead of risking being arrested for smuggling. But then it did another thing. It brought in new taxes on other items, sugar, coffee, wine, spices that were being imported into the colonies. So even though they cut the one tax in half, they added more other taxes. So really, we could say that their taxes really weren't decreased. And then the third provision for the Sugar Act was it gave the British authorities more, it gave the British officials more authority to enforce the law. And the penalties for smugglers was pretty steep. Here's some examples of what they could do. If a British official or officials, if they were to seize a colonial ship and board it to examine the contents, colonial merchants had to keep all of the goods that they were importing. They had to keep all the goods above deck. They couldn't have anything below deck. And everything above deck had to match up with the ship's manifest. So the Sugar Act gave the English officials in the colonies, those that were working for the government of England, Parliament, it gave them a broader authority. So if you were a merchant in the colonies and you were importing things in, you better have everything on deck. Another vital issue that is important in American history the Americans, they had their own colonial court system, and they embraced the judicial practice of having a trial in which you are tried by a jury of your peers. That was something that was dear to the colonists. Well, with the Sugar Act, and it might have been a continuation of this that was began in the Navigation Acts. The British set up a court called the Vice Admiralty Court. That is ADMIRALTY, Vice Admiralty. This was a court where if you were caught smuggling, you went before this judge of the Vice Admiralty Court. And this judge would alone rule on your conviction and your punishment. So with the Vice Admiralty courts, the colonists went from having a colonial court where you were tried by a jury of your peers to going before one judge who decided your fate. And remember, money is what makes the world go round. And so these judges who were over the Vice Admiralty courts, if they convicted a smuggler, they got 5% of the goods that were smuggled. So there's a little incentive for the judges to convict more colonists. Another financial incentive was if British officials seized a colonial ship and found illegal goods on it. The British received 1/3 of those seized goods. So very clearly, money is a central issue, if not the central issue, in this act. So the Sugar Act and its provisions leads the colonists to ask the question, what about our rights as Englishmen? Let us take a 7-minute break, and we'll come back and pick up with the Sugar Act. 7-minute break, which will take us to, well, let's do 6 minutes since we already had a break, 10:25. And if you're going to stick around, does anybody have any questions about any of the Module 2 assignments or the test? The next thing that is coming up, I think you should already be almost done with your discussion interaction. And let me just encourage you to remember that even when you complete your required number of discussion responses, you can still continue to engage in that with your classmates throughout the module. The more you discuss these things together, it'll just enrich your experience. But the next thing coming up will be a quiz that will be, you'll be able to access it Wednesday night at 10 p.m. And I believe it's due it'll be due Saturday the 23rd. I'll bring that up after our break. We got 4 more minutes. Yes, sir. The one in here?
No, the one on top of the other side.
The power's not on, or?
No, where's the breaker at?
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll be right there. Well, I think it's in the men's bathroom right by the water faucet. The water fountain right there in the hallway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I've got it ordered, and that one was the faster. That's the power turned off.
Okay. All right, great. Oh, okay. Huh? You want a break? I think this stuff appeared after you girls got home. Yes, so the quiz is over chapters 4 and 5. It'll be open book. There will not be a study guide for that, but you'll have 3 days to complete it. So that's the next thing coming up. Yeah, you should have had all your initial reply and then your responses to your classmates should have been done by last night. But again, you have until the end of the module to get all your required replies in. All right, no questions. Let's continue. Onward. One more thing about the Stamp Act. The English Parliament government gave English officials in the colonies, they gave them authority in the form of what was called writs, W-R-I-T-S, writs of assistance. And basically, this was a blanket search warrant. So it gave the English leaders in the colonies, those that were overseeing things for Parliament, gave them permission to board a ship and check the merchants' merchandise or goods. And but here's one thing that this is something that makes this so egregious in the colonists' minds. Many of the colonists worked out of their homes, and so with these writs of assistance, the British leaders in the colonies now had basically a free pass to go into anyone's home and do a search and seizure. So that was not looked upon, the way the colonists looked at it was just more almost repression and a bullying by the English leaders, Parliament. But concerning the Stamp Act, before we move on, the Sugar Act, you'll want to remember that it really didn't lower the taxes because they added new taxes. So taxation was enforced more strictly. And officials who worked for the government or for Parliament were given more broad authority. So taxation stricter and British authority broader. Now, many colonists grumbled about this, but it wasn't that widespread because the colonists that were affected by this was pretty much limited to those who were merchants and traders. If you were a farmer, or maybe not a farmer, but if you worked in something that was not producing a vital good that needed to be shipped, you weren't affected as much. So it wasn't a widespread protest by the colonists. It was kind of limited. Any questions on the Sugar Act before we move on? Okay, we're going to talk briefly about two more small acts. And then next, on Thursday, we'll jump into the Stamp Act, which was really the one that united the colonists. That was in 1765. So in between the Sugar and Stamp Act, there were two smaller acts. And I do not have, can you guys see that again, the timeline?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I don't have either of these on this timeline, but in 1764, after the Sugar Act, Grenville led Parliament to pass the Currency Act. The Currency Act. And what this act did was, remember, colonists were only supposed to purchase goods from England. They weren't technically allowed to purchase things from France or Spain or Holland. So the colonies had been printing their own paper money, but what the Currency Act of 1764 did was it required the colonists to pay for their British goods with nothing but gold and silver. Or if you were a person who produced a commodity that England wanted badly, like tobacco, you could pay for your British goods basically by bartering your tobacco. But you could not use paper money. It had to be gold and silver or a barter agreement. The Currency Act also said to the colonists, do not print any more paper money. So this act, colonists looked upon it as more overreaching regulations by the British. Any questions on the Currency Act? The Currency Act will probably be, if it's on the test at all, it will be something that would be like bonus. So the main things that you want to know are these things on this timeline. But I want to share these things that are not on here just to illustrate how England was becoming more and more intrusive. The next thing happened in 1765 before the Stamp Act, and that was the Quartering Act. All right, is that back up now, the Quartering Act?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So remember that there were 10,000 British soldiers left in the colonies in 1763. These are men who are away from their home country, so they don't have homes. And the Quartering Act of 1765 required colonists to house and feed British troops. Colonists did not like this. To them, it was another form of taxation because they were using their own resources and money. They now had to use it to feed and care for British soldiers who they did not want in the colonies. Not only did they see it as another form of taxation, but it was another way that Britain was repressing the colonists. Another thing that the colonists brought up, or something that they would have been curious about, was if these soldiers are here to protect our Western territory from Native Americans and from the defeated French, and if they are to patrol that border, the proclamation line of 1763, so that colonists, British colonists, do not move westward, why would they even be in our cities? Why would they be in Boston and New York and Philadelphia? Shouldn't they be on the frontier, protecting us, enforcing the proclamation line? So, again, it's about money. Parliament passes this law, and they do not have to send as much monetary support to these soldiers in the New World. Let the colonists, who are being protected, this is the way Parliament thought, right? We are providing these soldiers to protect them, so let them be a part of financing their own protection. So any questions on the Quartering Act? All right. So again, we want to sum up these rifts that are leading to revolution, beginning with the Proclamation of 1763, as Britain wanting to cash in as much as possible through the colonies. That's what their mercantile economy is all about. Draining, I shouldn't say draining, but benefiting from the resources of the colonies. And then the colonists are a captive market because they can only buy English products. And the colonists are rebelling a little bit, smuggling, doing things under the table. And so Britain, under the leadership of George Grenville, let's start passing these acts that will help us keep a tighter control on our financial cash cow in the New World. All right. Any questions? The Quartering Act will not be on that timeline either, but again, it might be on the test as a bonus question, or maybe for bonus points you can add the Quartering Act or the Currency Act onto the timeline, something of that nature. But you do want to know the Treaty of Paris, add that to the timeline, the Proclamation of 1763, George Grenville becoming the Prime Minister of England in 1763, will not be on the timeline, but will probably be somewhere on the test as a matching or fill in the blank or something of that nature. Okay, so tomorrow night, the quiz will be available at 10 p.m. You'll have 3 days to complete it. And if there's no questions, did anybody come in that was absent at the beginning of the class?
Everyone at Muldrow is still gone.
Okay. All right. Have a great day and a great Wednesday, and we'll see you on Thursday.